This is Pat Iyer with Legal Nurse Podcast, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with an experienced legal nurse consultant who I brought on the show to share her stories of being a legal nurse consultant, and how she got started, and what are some of the aspects of legal nurse consulting that she has learned that she would like to share with you. Meyer is the president of MedLaw Connection. She started her firm in 2005. She's based in Iowa, and she has 28 years of professional nursing experience that she brings to being a consultant and being an expert witness. Anne is board certified, and she was indeed past chair of the American Legal Nurse Consultant Certification Board, that group that makes up those exams that we take in order to become certified as an LNCC. She has lectured and published on several clinical topics, and she just completed what I might call an arduous term as the co-chair of the 4th edition of the textbook Legal Nurse Consulting Principles and Practices. Anne, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pat.
I'd like to take you back to when you first found out about legal nurse consulting. What was the piece of information that you got at that point that made you interested in this field?
That's a really good question. I actually, so I've been a nurse actually now for 30 years, so I'll give that up for 2 more years of, of nursing experience. But I had done a variety of different things as a clinician, and I was actually looking for something that maybe allowed me to do something entrepreneurial. And I actually also looked at going to law school as a totally separate career. And at the time, I had 2 kids that were in school, one in college, one in high school, and just timing didn't really pan out for that. And so I actually was working with another nurse that had started legal nurse consulting, and I just kind of delved into finding out a little bit more about that, and it was very intriguing to me, and so I jumped in and haven't looked back since. So I enjoy it a lot. So.
And how did you get your first case?
Well, I worked with, like I said, I actually had another nurse friend that was doing legal nurse consulting, and we kind of partnered up together and shared some of our experiences, and I went locally to talk with different attorneys that I knew outside of nursing, so some attorneys that I went to school with previously, that kind of thing, and one of them was nice enough to give me my first case, and it just kind of went from there. So.
And did this attorney explain to you very clearly what he was looking for, or she was looking for, or were you trying to figure it out as you went along?
It was more figuring out as I went along. The particular attorney hadn't really used a nurse before, and so we kind of figured it out together, actually, in regards to, I, obviously didn't have a lot of experience with some of the legal terminology and the processes and that kind of thing, so he was very helpful in that part of it. But really just identifying, getting the medical records, looking through them, and right away identifying that we were missing pieces of medical records, that kind of thing, just kind of sparked the initial process. And then from there, we kind of learned together in regards to how we were going to approach what he needed. And initially, I looking at the case, I looked at it from the perspective of the nurse as opposed to maybe from the plaintiff perspective of which he was. And so it was kind of a learning process to identify, the standard of care, and then looking at it from both sides, which then, of course, was most helpful to him. So.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming from the way you're describing your entry into the field that you didn't go through any type of LNC program. You used your nursing background to start working with attorneys the right way, or am I incorrect?
I did actually. I did go through the Vicki Milazzo Institute initially back in 2004. And from there, like I said, I just kind of started talking with different attorneys that that I knew personally, and that kind of helped me get a feel for what maybe some of them were looking for, and kind of get over that initial jitters of talking to somebody about what I could do.
Mm-hmm. You entered legal nurse consulting in 2005. There are many nurses who are intrigued with legal nurse consulting, and certainly there's a great deal more awareness of the field now in 2019 than there was in 2005. What advice would you give somebody who is in a clinical role and thinking about becoming a legal nurse consultant?
Well, I think the first thing to do is talk to some people that are doing legal nurse consulting to really identify what's involved in the process and what it all involves. I would never recommend to somebody to quit their day job, so to speak, before they just to go into legal nurse consulting. I think it would be best to kind of do some consulting on the side, perhaps to get their feet wet, to see if it's even something that they like. I think, again, like I said, talking to people that are in the role of legal nurse consulting is very helpful. Maybe doing some research in regards to some of the different programs that are out there. The American Association for Legal Nurse Consultants, the LNC, is a great organization to look at their website and to do some research in regards to finding out information about legal nurse consulting. There's a variety of listservs out there that are very helpful to nurses that you don't even really need to participate in. You can just kind of be a voyeur, so to speak, and kind of learn some of the ins and outs of what people are doing and talking about. The role of legal nurse consulting is quite vast, and there are a lot of different hats that a legal nurse consultant can wear. And so I think kind of finding out about that and some of the different roles that a legal nurse consultant can do to be a legal nurse consultant is very helpful to kind of help identify maybe what the individual nurse might be interested in.
We've had on our show a nurse who works for a toxicology company who analyzes what happens with accidents and people who are exposed to chemicals. We've had expert witnesses. We've had nurses who've worked in law firms. We've had independent consultants, a whole variety of roles that I think at first it seems like everyone thinks of legal nurse consulting as working for an attorney as an independent. And yet there, as you're pointing out, there's so many different options that are available. Nurses who do consulting with boards of nursing to make determinations on whether somebody's license should be suspended or revoked is another interesting role. We have a guest coming up who will be in that position, who'll be talking about her experiences. But I think the biggest question that I get on a frequent basis from inexperienced people is, how do I get started? How do I get my first case? How do I get my foot in the door? What advice, and I'm sure you get asked this question also, what advice do you give people when they present that to you?
Well, a couple of different things, actually. One would be first doing something similar to what I did. If they know of any attorneys, that are out there that do any type of medically related cases like personal injury or medical malpractice is something that is not everybody does. A lot more people do personal injury, so that might be an easier avenue to go as far as finding an attorney that does that type of work. Talking with friends and family that may know of attorneys that also do legal work can be helpful as well for that initial introduction. The other thing could be to actually, as I mentioned, talk to other nurses that do legal nurse consulting and see about maybe finding a mentor or maybe working on a case with someone else to kind of, again, get your feet wet and get into the door that way to kind of initially really identify what's involved again in the process and seeing if that's something that they want to do. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a key point, something that you want to do. The other component is it something that you have the skills to do?
Oh, that's true, yes. That's true too, yes.
We come out of nursing school almost knowing how to take care of patients, almost, and we get put into a clinical environment where hopefully we've got good mentoring and support. But when we come out of nursing school, we know how to chart, we know how to assess, we know how to observe, we know how to teach patients. What I find many young, inexperienced legal nurse consultants struggle with is, how do I create a work product? How do I analyze information? How do I write reports that are what the attorney is looking for? What kind of skills do you see in terms of the legal nurse consulting role, doing the work? And I'm not talking about the marketing, but doing the work. What kinds of skills have you seen to be essential? And the other part of that is, have you met legal nurse consultants who really wanted to do the work, but they couldn't do the work?
Yes, definitely. I think some of the skill sets that really set people apart are typically people that are very detail oriented and able to review information and again, you mentioned analyzing. So not only reading the information, but analyzing the information for its contents and what it may, how do I want to say this, how it will fit into, if you will, the big picture of the case. So the first thing would be identifying what are the issues at hand. And then, so for example, if it was a slip and fall case or a wound case or a misdiagnosis or something like that. So kind of identifying what the issues are at hand, but then also being able to have the skill set to dissect the records, if you will. I find a lot of people actually now, especially with the electronic medical record, really haven't had the experience of going in and finding information in different places within the EMR. And it's interesting to me because I'm an old school nurse and I charted back when we were doing everything on paper. And it seemed that we did a lot more of reviewing of information as a clinician back when we were doing that versus now, where the EMR is very segregated, if you will, and there's a lot of different screens that you have to jump back and forth between to find particular information. And while some people may do that to a certain extent, it seems that they're finding something very specific versus looking at the whole record. So I think that kind of is an interesting aspect for some people when they're getting into the role, is that they have never done that before, where they've actually done record review. So being very detail oriented, having the experience of looking through a medical record and knowing the different components of a medical record. Surprisingly, when I have hired subcontractors, I've thought that's something that everybody knew and that it would be pretty commonplace to know the different parts of the medical record, and surprisingly, a lot of people don't. So I think just having that, experience or the willingness to learn, that is very helpful. Having an open mind, I think, is very key in regards to looking at it not only from the nursing perspective, as I mentioned earlier, but also from the plaintiff perspective. So looking at it from, having that open mind and not being super critical of or hypercritical of certain issues or events. And then also having good communication skills. I think that is so incredibly important in regards to communicating with whoever is hiring you. So really identifying what it is that they want so that you're not doing too little and you're not doing too much. You don't want to, create this huge work product when the attorney wanted you to simply review the records and give them a phone call and talk about what you saw. I've seen where people will want to bill for, 20 hours of work when really it should have only taken 4 hours, because the attorney didn't want this large chronology or something like that. So having that communication and really identifying what it is that the attorney wants and needs, and then allowing for that open communication of what you're seeing and how to move forward within the case workup is, I think, really important as well.
As you were going through the issues, I've thought about the many expert witnesses who I hired and trained, and all of the above issues of particularly spending too much time on analysis of a case, going into too much detail. One of the people in my coaching program at LNC Academy had an experience recently with a case involving an air embolism. She went through the records before giving them to her subcontractor, and she spent a couple of hours and she located the incident, which was right before the code and the death of the patient. And she told her subcontractor, don't spend any more than 4 hours on this case, thinking she would be generous. And the expert witness spent 7 hours going through the records. Supposedly a person with some experience. But again, I think you're pointing out that we have to use critical thinking skills, and yet there's a learning curve. And that frustrates legal nurse consultants who are new to either the particular type of case review or new to the field, is that they want to be thorough, they want to be detail oriented, but they don't have a sense of what's too much time. So that creates problems, especially when they want to bill for their time and then they don't get paid and they feel bitter because they're not paid.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's really important to realize up front, is that, it's very nice to think that you can go and bill these, high dollar per hour, to spend a few hours and make a lot of money, or not work any weekends or holidays or things like that. And I think that's really important to realize that that's not necessarily the case. And that's why I think, again, it's really important to actually talk with a nurse that does legal nurse consulting in their research, to identifying if it's something that they want to venture into, because, just like with anything, there's pros and cons, obviously, and good and bad. And dealing with attorneys is a lot of times like dealing with physicians, again, good and bad. And so I think it's really good to have a clear understanding and talk with more than one person, so that you go in with your eyes open, as opposed to kind of having this grandiose idea, for example, of, again, billing hundreds of dollars per hour for something that obviously, like you said, there is a great learning curve for. And many times when I'm training people, I will say, this would take me about this many hours to do this, and that's what we're going to bill for. If you go above and beyond that, that's something that we have to talk about in regards to that learning curve. And, initially, I think you can't expect not to have that learning curve. And sometimes you need to do it for your own self as well, to make sure that you're not missing anything, but with the understanding that as you get more experienced, you'll have that feeling of confidence, and you'll be able to do things in a shorter time frame, of which then you won't be having so much of that learning curve time. But even still, now, after I've been doing this for 15 years, I always review my bill before I send it out and identify if perhaps there were maybe a couple hours extra spent here or there, what have you, and shaving some of that off the time that I bill for, just to make sure that it's appropriate for what we want to do. And, it's, you have to be very careful. You don't want to overbill, but you don't want to underbill either. So you don't want to undervalue yourself, but in the same end, we don't want to, like I said, bill for something that the attorney didn't even want. If you do that kind of thing, it's very likely they're not going to utilize your services again. So it's something to be very cautious of.
You're right. I had an experience with an attorney who asked me for a detailed chronology of the first week of an admission. And we gave him the detailed chronology that was 25 or 30 pages long. And he said detailed. We gave him detail. And he got this and he said, I was expecting something that was 5 or 6 pages long. And no, I'm not going to pay you your $3,000 bill that you've sent me. And we ended up not getting paid the full amount. And he ended up not using us again. And I went back over my notes. And this happened to me as an experienced legal nurse consultant, where I thought it was very clear what he was asking for. And I said, well, perhaps when we work together next time, if you have an example of a chronology that you're looking for in terms of depth, that would be helpful. Despite me planting the seed when we work together next time. There was no next time.
Yeah.
And that was actually okay because I didn't want to work with someone who was going to fight me over a communication issue.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the most, or one of the most memorable cases that you worked on. What stands out in your mind when you think about the multiple stories that have flowed in and out of your office? What's one that really makes you think about what happened to a person?
Well, and there are multiple, and it's it's very interesting. Kind of when I thought about that ahead of us speaking today, I had a difficulty actually just finding a couple things that really stood out because there are so many, and it really kind of identifies that we are needed and that this role that we portray is and that we fill is very needed and necessary. And one of the things that I thought about when I was getting into legal nurse consulting was how much I really, really liked being a bedside nurse. And I was afraid of getting into legal nurse consulting because I was fearful of getting away from that thing that I really liked. But what I found was that this really fills a lot of those boxes as well in regards to I still feel that I'm helping patients, and I also still feel that I'm being a good team player for other nurses as well. So in that, I think one of the cases that stands out the most to me is actually, there were a couple of them actually that were kind of oddly back to back, where they were mental health patients that were in long-term care facilities. And they both were, one came in actually from behavioral health hospital that had closed. And so they needed to find placement for these residents that were in this hospital. And so the long-term care facility was where they went. And unfortunately, while the long-term care facility touted that they, managed a lot of patients with dementia, they really didn't manage patients with mental health issues. And so one of the things that it was just really devastating, and every time I would review the records or my report or things like that as we were working up the case, I truly, my stomach would just turn in regards to this poor person that really wasn't being managed the way that he should have been managed as a resident of this facility and a person with these issues of mental health that, issues that he had. And the nursing staff just wasn't equipped to handle a patient like this. And it was very unfortunate that the facility accepted the patient and that they didn't identify that they weren't equipped to manage the care. And so unfortunately, the patient died, and there were a lot of issues throughout the course of that case. It really almost hit every aspect of things that you look at in long-term care type cases in regards to mismanagement of the health conditions of the patient and the medications, development of wounds and malnutrition and dehydration, and just really it just went throughout the whole gamut. And it was just really interesting to me to see this unfold as you review the records, and the fact that there was never anything identified along the way that like I said, that they identified that they weren't appropriate to care for this person. So that was one of the cases. And another one kind of on the other side of it was actually a hospital case where a nurse was being blamed basically for the mismanagement of the patient and the lack of care of the patient. And as one of the things that we bring to the table as a clinician, having experience in different types of settings, is knowing the inner workings, the processes of the facility and how things work, and knowing when we call physicians and when we don't call physicians, or when we call physicians and they don't call us back. And it was very interesting to kind of read between the lines, if you will, of what the nurse was saying. The nurse was trying to get a hold of the physician. The nurse went up the chain of command and basically was being thrown under the bus by the facility as far as the person that was holding the bag, so to speak, versus the physician or the entity of it, in itself. So that was kind of eye-opening as well, and kind of exciting to work on in regards to the fact of identifying those other issues and kind of helping to absolve the issues of the nurse. So
I think people listening will identify with that awful feeling of trying to reach a physician and not getting a response back, and starting to feel a level of desperation.
Right, for sure, yeah.
Interesting.
And I think having that strong clinical background is another one of the other I don't want to say talents, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, what I want to say, but the characteristics, if you will, of a good legal nurse consultant, as well as, having that strong clinical background is very important, because you may get cases that are across the spectrum of, of care, as far as adult to, older adult, pediatric, what have you, and to identify what you're really appropriate to review and what you're not. And to have, again, the strong clinical skills of, knowing what labs are, what medications are, and then knowing what resources you have available to you, and be willing to research to find the correct references that you need to help with your case.
Well, you've highlighted in a lot of the analytical skills, understanding how the medical record is organized. I would echo putting in having strong writing skills. Any tips as we wind up the show on working with attorneys, other than the fact that they're a lot like doctors?
Again, I think, communication is very important. Maintaining professionalism, I think, is really important. Some attorneys will be very friendly and very open, and I think it's very easy to get into kind of a relaxed conversation or relationship, if you will. And I think while that's all well and good, it's still really important to maintain professionalism. The thing that I've benefited from the most is word of mouth referrals from one attorney to another. And I think, a lot of that goes back to, obviously, being very conscientious with my work that I do, but also maintaining that professionalism and being very cognizant of their time, and, again, having that open communication.
Excellent. I appreciate the words of wisdom that you've shared with our audience. How can they find out more about your business?
Well, I have a website. My company, again, is Med Law Connection, and my website is www.medlawconnection.com. That's all one word, no hyphens. I am also available by email or phone, and that information is on my website.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Anne, for sharing your expertise with our audience. I appreciate that. Appreciate you being a guest on the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You are welcome. And I appreciate you, the listener, You are either watching this podcast on our app called Biz.edu, which you can get at legalnursebusiness.com/BIZEDU, or you're watching it on YouTube, or you're listening on one of the audio platforms. I appreciate you paying attention, and I hope that Anne has given you some tips that will help you in your legal nurse consulting business. We'll be back again next week with a new show, and thanks for being part of this show.